First of all, what is your assessment on the current state of U.S.-China relationship?
I always say it's difficult to compress this relationship with one or two words. It has always been complex. There are many areas in which we have great cooperation, such as we've seen recently on the Iran nuclear agreement, where the United States worked with China to get that agreement along with Russia and the European nations. We also have seen important agreement recently on climate change, with China and the United States coming into alignment on the need to do something about it. And I also have to say that even though there are occasional disagreements with respect to trade, the trading relationship between our two countries has been significant and enormously beneficial to both countries over the last 40-odd years of my experience. Yet there are issues with China that cause difficulties, such as the concerns we have about cybersecurity. We need greater understanding and transparency of what's going on in the sea. Claims on islands and building up of coral reefs and building up of islands right out of the bottom of the ocean. And what are they being used for? And why such large landing strips? So these kinds of issues cause us difficulty. So as with any country of that size and that importance, there will always be some difficulties, but I think on balance, the relationship has been sound. It has been solid for many, many years. And the evidence is the progress that China has made over the last 44 years since my first visit to China. The progress that China has made and the fact that China is playing a more important role on the world stage. This causes some tension because people are worried about the new role that China wishes to play. But I think that is manageable because China has interests that can be met by the world, and the world has interests that can be met by China. And the degree of trade that goes back and forth, not only with China and the West, China and Taiwan, I mean, there's an incredible amount of trade that goes back and forth. So I think it is a complex relationship, but one that has been managed rather well for the last 40-something years.
What are your expectations for President Xi Jinping's upcoming state visit? What can a state visit like this achieve from your vantage point?
I've been to a lot of state visits in the course of my time as chairman, as national security advisor, and as secretary of state. And sometimes it's so important just to have the style look proper, where both sides show respect to each other, and protocol is followed to the finest point, so that everybody is satisfied with the visit. But there can also be great substance comes from the visit. I'm quite sure that President Obama and President Xi will talk about the issue of cybersecurity. I think the issue of human rights will come up. And I think the issues associated with what's happening in the sea will come up, and how do we resolve the conflicts that exist in the area between China and its neighbors over territorial claims. The United States has offered to help, but the countries in the region, especially China, prefer to handle it as bilateral issues with the various countries in the region. So I think those are going to be the principal issues. I think they will also talk about the Syrian problem. I think they will talk about how both countries can work together to see if solutions cannot be found to that conflict. I think the president will also express concern about what's happening in North Korea once again, with the young leader shaking the uranium in the pot, if I could use that kind of colloquial expression. But every time he wants to get attention to himself, he does something like pretend he's going to shoot a rocket, or he starts up a reactor. And I'm sure that'll be a subject of discussion. We have always felt that perhaps our Chinese friends could do more to constraining his ambitions and his adventuresome activities. And I hope that will be the discussion. Recently, it seems like China has taken a slightly more objective approach to North Korea, and perhaps they will do a better job of encouraging the young leader to seek a new path to the future.
I understand. You were very involved in the six-party talks back in the 2000s. And understand. But back to the U.S.-China relationship, do you think that, as President Xi does, that the U.S. and China can somehow create a new pattern of power politics that avoids the inevitable rivalry between a rising power and the already dominant one that we saw over and over again in history?
I think so, and I wouldn't even like to characterize it as power politics. What it is that we have two nations that have interest in the Pacific region, in the Western Pacific, and in Asia generally. And the United States, for many, many years, decades, had been the dominant military power in that region and the dominant political power. And now China has risen, and China is the second largest economy in the world. China has interest in that part of the world, and because of its economic strength, its new political ascendancy, it wishes to play a more dominant role. But we can't have dominance. Two people can't be dominant at the same time. So I think we'll have to find a way to work with each other, exchange views on the things that trouble us, ask China to tell us more with respect to transparency on their military activities and the issue of the islands. But I think it is quite possible for our two nations and the other nations in the region. We can't ignore Japan and Australia, New Zealand, all the other nations in that part of the world, South Korea. All of us have to come together and understand that the region is best served by peace and by stability and by open dialogue. And open dialogue means disagreement. You can't have a dialogue unless you're having some disagreement. And I just hope that the disagreements that will come along in any relationship can be handled in a way that reflects diplomacy. In my 4 years as Secretary of State and in my previous assignment as Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and National Security Advisor, had a number of problems with the Chinese, but we were always able to work our way through it. The most prominent of these is the famous incident that occurred in April of 2001, where our two planes collided. And a number of people here in the United States were saying, oh, we now have a crisis with China. And I said, no, we've had an accident. Let's not let this incident become a crisis. And within about 2 weeks, my Chinese colleagues and I, and the leadership in the White House and the leadership in Beijing were able to come up with a solution that calmed things down. And frankly, because we were able to solve it without any crisis, created a new friendship between the United States and China as to how we should deal with things like this. And my foreign minister colleague at that time, Foreign Minister Tang, and I, we understood one another better. And the first time I saw him after that incident rather, I said to him, you know, in the future when something like this happens, we should talk to each other immediately so we don't let things get out of control. So here's my home phone number. You can call me anytime, 7 days a week, 24 hours a day. If you want to go through the State Department, fine, but you don't have to. Just dial me direct, and I will be there for you.
Did then Foreign Minister Tang call you?
We've talked that way, yes. He used to call me on my cell phone. Yeah, we once had a long conversation when I was in Israel, driving through the mountains, and he wanted to talk to me about something, and took it right away. But I always wanted to have that kind of relationship with Foreign Minister Tang, with Foreign Minister Li, with my other colleagues there, with your current Foreign Minister. I know them all rather well, and I feel that I have been able to demonstrate to them the goodwill of the American people, but also the concerns of the American people. That's what a mature relationship is. When you're honest about your concerns and say, look, this is bothering us. And we also understand that we have different systems, different political systems. We're going to tell you about ours, you tell us about yours. We have some questions about your human rights activity, about suppression of freedom of expression. And so let's discuss these issues. We are not in a position to change your system. It works for you. Ours works for us. So let's find areas of cooperation, and when areas of conflict arise, then let's use our best diplomatic efforts to solve those problems.
That's behind the scenes to understand the 2001 collision better. With regard to rebalance to Asia, or pivot to Asia policy initiated by President Obama in 2011, how should China understand that? To what extent do you think that is a China containment policy?
I never use the word containment because you can't contain China, nor should we think we can contain China. I never would have used the term pivot. I think it was a bad choice of words. Why? Because you're pivoting towards something, and you're pivoting away from somebody, And so it was a term that seemed to annoy both the Chinese, who thought we were now coming after them in a containment strategy, and it annoyed our friends in Europe and the Middle East and elsewhere because it gave the impression we were turning away. America can't turn away from anywhere. We are represented throughout the world. We have interests throughout the world. And I've never used the term containment with respect to China. I think it's a lot better to use different kinds of language, such as let's discuss a problem. Why are you doing this? Why don't you tell us more about your military activity? You know everything we do. You can read it in the newspaper. Let's get along as two mature countries that have interests.
I want to move on to the economic sphere. There's a slowdown of Chinese economy, and the market volatility is much talked about here. How concerned are you about the Chinese slowdown and its potential impact on the U.S. economy?
Well, it's having an impact on the world's economy, but the world's economy is having an impact on the Chinese economy. It's all interconnected. And so, as like any other official, I'm concerned about that. I think China understands the problem it has. It's been sailing along at wonderful growth rates for decades, 8, 9, 10%. And then suddenly things have started to change, and they have come to realize that some changes are going to be needed in their economic policy, the fiscal policy and monetary policy. I'm not an economist, but the one thing I do know, and I've been watching it for years now, is that China has to encourage its own people to be more consumer-like, like the rest of us. And I'll never forget, several years ago, I was visiting a Chinese think tank, and I was asking, what is the strategy for the future? And the answer was very, very simple. 4 parts. 1, we have to continue getting investment from the West, especially the United States. 2, we have to keep selling things to the West, especially the United States. 3, we have to start consuming more here in China and not always expect to have an economy that's going to be export supported alone. And we have the largest consumer market in the world. So let's start using that. And the 4th one I've never forgotten was he said, and remember, we have been very successful over the last 40 years in bringing 400 million people up out of poverty. And I consider that an absolutely great achievement on the part of China to have done this. And we can see it in all the cities and all the other fascinating things that have been done. But remember, General Powell, we still have 800 million people who are waiting their turn. And they need to have the same kinds of opportunities as the 400 million who are doing well. And so our focus has to be on rebuilding our infrastructure, going into the interior, creating new factories and plants, and having more of an industrial revolution out in the countryside so that everybody doesn't come to the cities, and so that additional wealth can be created. But as you do that with more factories, you need more markets to sell the products of the factories. And so China faces an interesting situation with respect to increasing consumer spending, making sure it's done in a way that does not affect too seriously their economic relations with the rest of the world. And 3, bringing more and more people up out of poverty, just as you've done with 400 million already.
General Powell, you mentioned the refugee crisis in Europe. Do you think part of the reason was the U.S. involvement in the region several years ago, and therefore do you think U.S. perhaps should do more to accept refugees?
Well, the president has announced a new goal, but I think really the problem is essentially a European refugee problem, although we can do some more. But to go to the point of what caused it all, I think it was not, you just can't say it was because the United States did military things over the last 10 or so years. The real problem was the oppressive regimes that existed in that part of the world, and the way in which they were treating their people, the way in which they would not reform themselves, even though the Arab Spring had occurred. And people were demanding a different kind of lifestyle, a lifestyle where they can decide who their leaders are, and that the wealth of the country flowed down to all the people in the country. And so very unstable situations were created. And obviously when there are military activities taking place, this creates uncertainty and danger within a society and might lead to moving to try to get somewhere else. And it's a tragic situation to see it now. But it's got to be laid on a number of factors and not just pointed at the United States.
The Iran nuclear deal, is it a good deal for the world? It's
being criticized because people say you've left open an avenue in the future for Iran to pursue a nuclear weapon. Well, that is a possibility. There's another possibility, that because we have froze their program for the next 10 or 15 years, the program will not be able to just start up again. It will have atrophied. And then the third possibility is that Iran was willing to give up so much in this agreement that it's going to be hard for them to change their mind again. And in 10 or 15 years, when they would have that opportunity, they decide to take it again. So all of these are possibilities. Some of our critics on this issue, critics of mine since I supported it, say, oh, that's what they're going to do. They're going to start up again. But that's only one possibility. They may do other things, not start up because the system is atrophied, it's not up to it. Or third, they have made a decision that this doesn't make any sense, like the Libyans did some years ago. And so let's not prejudge the future. None of us are fortune tellers. What we can judge is the present. And the present with this agreement, and with China a part of it, Russia a part of it, and the Europeans a part of it, the UN a part of it, EU a part of it. This agreement right now does freeze their program, even though it allows them to produce some minor amounts of uranium for power generation purposes, but not enough at an enrichment level to create a weapon. That is a remarkable achievement. Others say, well, yeah, but they're still involved in terrorism and they're still doing all kinds of terrible things. Yes, we have to work on that. And we can't forget that, and we got to keep pressing them on that. But what they can't do is use nuclear weapons to push forward with those objectives, because those weapons are frozen. And I don't think we've given enough credit to the simple reality that for the next 10 or 15 years, as we wait to see how that future unfolds, those nuclear weapons programs have been stalled.
You have been going to China for the past 45 years. Mm-hmm. What impressed you the most among all your interactions with the Chinese leaders? What vibes did you get from the Chinese people and its culture?
When I was there in 1973, the Cultural Revolution was just ending. The age of backyard furnaces and all of that was coming to an end. And my most vivid impression as a young officer, and this was in the middle of the Cold War, was the people looked like it was a black and white movie. Everybody dressed alike. All the soldiers looked alike. The uniforms were alike, even if they were generals or privates. The women dressed alike, the men dressed alike. And there seemed to be a lack of color, if I can put it that way, in the society. But then over the next 40 years now, I have seen color explode, and I've seen the entrepreneurial spirit that was always within the Chinese spirit, or within the Chinese soul, explode to create the kind of economic miracle that we have seen in the last 40 years. And so what impresses me most is the contrast between that post-cultural revolution China I saw in 1973 and what I now see in 2015. It's remarkable. It's changing from black and white to Technicolor, CinemaScope. And I'll never forget when it was Deng Xiaoping who made the most important economic decision in China's recent history that said, I no longer care if it's a black cat or a white cat, as long as it catches mice. I don't care if you call it a free enterprise system or a socialist system, as long as it creates wealth. And it was the understanding that wealth creation is what gives you the ability to bring people up out of poverty. And if you're not creating wealth, then you're not going to bring them up out of poverty. And how did China create that wealth? By being part of an interconnected international economic community, and by selling us things. And I've often kidded with my fellow Americans. China, they send stuff to Walmart, Walmart sells it, the money goes back to China, and then China lends it to us to solve our deficit. It's a wonderful business cycle.
Not bad at all. Yeah, that's a fair assessment, I guess.
Nobody's going to put that at risk. It benefits all parties. American consumers get good products at a fairly reasonable cost. China makes money on it, and China uses its money to invest in China and also to be the banker for some of us.